So for the next couple of weeks, we'll be talking about the cardiovascular system. That includes the heart and the blood vessels, and we'll also have a short lecture on blood cells as well at the end of the unit. So we'll start really this lecture talking about the heart itself, and then we'll have a separate lecture for arteries, probably a separate small lecture for veins, because the veins tend to mirror the arteries, and then a separate lecture for blood components as well. So if we just look at the purpose of circulation, or the way that circulation works in the body, just think about the fact that all of the cells of your body, they need to make energy to survive, right? So let's just take one simple thing like the production of energy through ATP. Well, in order to do that, those cells need to receive typically an energy source like glucose and oxygen. And the way that those cells receive those nutrients and those gases is through the circulation, through the blood flow. So as fresh blood flows by the tissues of our body, those nutrients and gases are able to leave the blood and enter these cells so that the cells can make the energy they need to survive. Now, besides just making energy, there's also electrolytes that are needed, there's hormones that need to be circulated, and not just bringing good material to the tissues, but there's also the necessity of taking waste material away from the tissue. So things that are left over from cellular metabolism. So when the cells make energy, for example, the byproduct is water and carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide needs to get brought back to the lungs so that you can breathe that off and remove that carbon dioxide from your body. But there's also other acids and byproducts of cellular metabolism when proteins are made, for example, that need to be carried maybe to the kidneys or maybe to the liver in order to be removed from the blood supply and removed from the body. We also have immune cells. So our immune cells are made, let's say some of them are made in the lymph nodes or the thymus gland, and they need to be circulated throughout the body. So they get put into the blood, and then the blood carries them all around the body. So the point is, we need circulation to both bring the good stuff and to take away the bad stuff from our tissues. So when circulation drops, when we don't have good blood flow to our tissues and our tissues are not able to get the good stuff or get rid of the bad stuff, cells begin to die. So maintaining circulation is a top priority for your body, and we're going to talk about how your body is structured to help facilitate this circulation of material. When we get to physiology, we'll talk more about blood pressure and contractility of the heart, and how your body, the changes that your body can make on a moment-by-moment basis to maintain an adequate blood pressure. But for here in anatomy, we'll just kind of go through the pump and the pipes, as I like to call it. So you should think of the cardiovascular system really as a two-part system. So there are two circuits, and each circuit has a pump and pipes that go along with the pump. So for both of the systems, the heart is the pump, but what we're going to find out is that the right heart and the left heart are pumping simultaneously, and the right heart is going to be the pump for the pulmonary circulation, and the left heart side of the heart is going to be the pump for the systemic circulation. The pipes are just going to be the arteries and veins, and so on the most simple level, we can define an artery as a tube that carries blood away from the heart, and veins will be tubes that carry blood towards the heart. And the reason I give you this definition is because a lot of times we think that arteries carry oxygenated blood and veins carry deoxygenated blood. And that's true almost all the time, but there is an exception, and that's when we get to the pulmonary vasculature. And so we'll see that a better definition of artery and vein is whether the blood is flowing towards the heart or away from the heart. So if you just kind of look here at the schematic, you can see that we have the right side of the heart, and we'll say that right ventricle in particular, that's the pump. and then you've got some pipes going up to the lungs, and then we'll see those pipes carrying oxygenated blood back to the heart. So that is circuit number 1. Right heart, lungs, and back to the left atrium. That's the first circuit. The second circuit is going to be left ventricle, and that's going to pump blood up to the brain and head and neck, as well as to the arms, legs, abdomen, and the rest of the body. So that will be circuit number 2, and that's a much larger circuit. It's larger, quite literally just in the volume that needs to be pumped. It's also larger in the sense of the length of the tubes, the distance that the blood has to travel. And for that reason, if you just think about the right-sided pump that goes to the lungs as being closer, smaller, lower volumes, lower pressures, that means the pump has to work less than the pump on the left. So the left ventricle, which is the pump for the systemic circulation, it has to pump more blood at a higher pressure over longer distances. And so the left ventricle has to pump harder, work harder. And therefore, it ends up being just about twice as big as far as the muscle is concerned as the right ventricle. And we'll see this when we look at the gross anatomy of the heart. And that's because these two circuits are quite different. One requires a very strong pump, that's the left side, and one requires a pump that does not have to push against such high pressures. All right, so here's a picture of that double circuit as I was mentioning. You can see the pulmonary circuit up here, and then kind of artificially the systemic circuit down here. So in simple form, if we take the right side of the heart, there's the right ventricle, and it's going to be the pump for the pulmonary circuit. And then we take the left ventricle here, and that's the pump for the systemic circulation. You're going to eventually get arteries that feed the tissue, and then you're going to get veins on the other side that carry away the waste products that need to eventually go to the lungs, to the kidneys, to the liver, or wherever. And it's going to eventually return that blood to the heart so that it can go through the pulmonary circulation again and receive oxygen, and that happens 60 times a minute for most of us. So the primary pump, we talked about the pumps already for the right and for the left heart, but the primary pipe for the pulmonary circuit is the pulmonary arteries, and so they come off of the right ventricle and through that semi-lunar valve, and then you get the pulmonary artery, and then it splits into right and left to go to the right and left side of the lungs. And the primary pump for the systemic circulation is going to be the aorta. We're going to see the aorta is really kind of the king or the master pipe for the systemic circulation. Pretty much everything is going to come off of the aorta. All right, so if we just look at the gross anatomy, looking at the external gross anatomy of the heart, and you're looking at someone from an anterior view, so you're looking at their chest, this is what the heart would look like. So it doesn't look anything like, I don't know where we got this as being a heart. I always think it looks more like a boot almost, something more like that when I draw it out. And so we can describe the borders of the heart in several ways. I'll give you a couple of them here. You can have a right border, left border, inferior border, and superior border, and that's fine. I'll show you on the next slide a couple of different names for some of these borders that we use more often clinically. But you can also see, looking at the chest here on the picture, that the heart is, yes, in the center, where the sternum is, but you can see that the majority of it is off to the left a little bit, and it's just above that xiphoid process. And so this is why, for example, when you do CPR, you feel for that xiphoid process, and then you put your hand up, and you're gonna put the palm of your hand right about there on the sternum. There's two reasons for that. One is that xiphoid down here can break, And so you don't want to have your palm over that when you're doing chest compressions. But the other one is that's just closer to where the majority of the heart is. If you're putting your palm down here, you're not really compressing over the heart. And so you want to be up just a couple fingers breaths above that xiphoid process, and then you'll have your hand over the heart. You don't want to move your hand off to the left, even though more of the heart is there, because you'll break the ribs. So we just stay right here over the sternum, just above the xiphoid process. A couple of other names that we actually use a little bit more commonly, at least clinically. We talk about the base of the heart. And this, to me, this was always a little bit confusing because when I hear the word base, I think the bottom of something. But in this case, the base of the heart is actually the top of the heart. And it's called the base because it's the part of the heart where all of the great blood vessels go in or out of the heart. And so in that sense, it's the base for the blood vessels to enter or to leave. And so we call the top of the heart the base of the heart. And then that allows us to call this kind of, as I mentioned, the shape of the heart is kind of a little bit more like a boot. And so the toe portion of that boot would be called the apex of the heart. And so those are a couple of words that we do use clinically, apex and base of the heart, and they're probably a little more useful than superior or inferior margin. The other thing I wanted to mention here from this picture is the pericardial cavity, and we talked about this early on in the course, so this should be a little bit of review for you. But just remember there's two layers here, just like there were in the lungs. There's a layer of pericardium that covers the heart itself. That would be the visceral pericardium. And then there is another second layer of pericardium that kind of overlays that, the parietal pericardium. And in between those two layers, there is a tiny, tiny space. Now, normally it's filled with just a tiny amount of fluid just to give some lubrication so that as the heart beats 60 times a minute, remember, it's going to be moving in that sac, and you don't want those two connective tissue linings to be rubbing on each other. And so there's a little bit of fluid there to kind of keep it moist, just like we talked about with the pleural cavity. And so that's kind of normal. But sometimes that pericardial space, that pericardial cavity, gets filled with excessive fluid. Usually that's from some kind of inflammation or infection, something that we call myocarditis, for example. Or when I was in Africa, we would see a pericardial effusion that had pus in it, and it was from tuberculosis, because tuberculosis is so common in many parts of Africa. We would see some of the complications, and one of the complications is to get actually an infection there in the pericardial sac, and it would cause pus to build up there. So this is kind of showing you an exaggerated picture of the pericardial cavity with one layer lining the heart, which is the hand, and the other layer surrounding that. And so you can see here on the picture, this is an ultrasound, or what we call an echocardiogram of the heart. And so this is the heart here, and this is the left ventricle. And you can tell because look at how thick that wall is versus the right ventricle there. So you see it's probably at least twice, if not 3 times the size of the right ventricle. And the pericardium normally you can't see on an ultrasound. Normally you don't see the space. It's so small and there's so little fluid that you actually see no space. Now on an ultrasound, fluid looks black. So for example, this is the cavity of the right ventricle and the cavity of the left ventricle, and they're filled with blood, so it looks black. Well, notice this black area here. That is fluid surrounding the heart. That should not be there. You should not be able to see that on an ultrasound. When you see that much fluid surrounding the heart, that means you have what we call a pericardial effusion. Effusion just means a buildup of fluid. And so it's a buildup of fluid in that pericardial cavity, often from a viral infection, from some kind of inflammatory reaction. Sometimes it's an autoimmune problem. Your body's kind of attacking itself. Or when we were in Africa, it can be infectious, like from tuberculosis. Whatever the cause is, if you get too much fluid built up there, the heart only pumps when it can do two things. It has to be able to squeeze, and it has to be able to relax and fill with blood. Well, if you've got that sac filled with fluid, then the heart is not able to relax fully. And so when it's trying to relax and fill with blood, it's not able to fill with as much blood because the pressure from this fluid is pushing against the heart and preventing it from opening fully, relaxing, and filling with blood. Well, eventually this will lead to reduced circulation. You'll get less blood pumping out of the heart, you'll get a reduced blood pressure, you'll get reduced circulation, and tissues will begin to die. So we have to fix that problem. If it's a fairly large one like this, we would actually introduce a needle into that sac, and we would draw that fluid off, and then we would leave a little catheter, a little tube in there, so that we could continue to drain the fluid or pus that's in there, and we would relieve the pressure, and then the heart would be able to beat normally again. So let's look at the kind of internal anatomy of the heart. If we took a cross section of the heart and kind of took the front section off, and I guess maybe cross section is not the right word. Let's say like a coronal section of the heart, and we took the anterior portion off and looked into the heart, this is what you would see. So I'm sure you all have learned at some point that there are 4 chambers to the heart. There are 2 upper chambers, which we call atria for plural, or atrium for singular. And then there are 2 ventricles, the right and the left. The right atrium is going to be the one that receives deoxygenated blood, used up blood from the body. It's going to come from the top of the body, from the head and neck and arms, through the superior vena cava, and it's going to come down into the right atrium. And then it's going to also come from the lower half of the body, from the abdomen, from the lower limbs, through the inferior vena cava, and it's going to drain into the right atrium from there. From there, the blood will go through a valve, the tricuspid valve, into the right ventricle, and then as the right ventricle squeezes, it will go through another valve, the pulmonic valve, and it will go into the pulmonary artery, which eventually splits into right and left pulmonary arteries. And then it will take that blood to the lungs. And we said the blood will then come back from the lungs through the pulmonary veins. Now notice the pulmonary veins are red in the picture because these are the only veins that bring oxygenated blood to tissue. So this is why we don't talk about veins in terms of oxygenated or deoxygenated blood, but rather we use the terms coming towards the heart or going away from the heart. So because the pulmonary veins are carrying blood towards the heart, they're still called veins. But because they just left the lungs, they have all that fresh oxygen. It's actually oxygenated blood coming back to the heart. In the same way, notice that the pulmonary arteries are really the only artery that carries deoxygenated blood. And the reason is it's carrying blood away from the heart, so it's an artery, but it's the old used up blood, so it's deoxygenated. All right, once the blood returns from the pulmonary veins, it enters the left atrium, and then the blood has to go through the mitral valve into the left ventricle, and then as the ventricles contract, the blood goes up through the aortic valve and into the aorta and then out to the rest of the body. So that left ventricle becomes the pump for the systemic circulation, and that right ventricle is the pump for the pulmonary circulation. All right, if we kind of look at some of these chambers from the outside of the heart, this is an anterior view here. So again, this is if you're looking at someone's chest. You can see that from an anterior view, most of what you see on the heart is right-sided heart. You can see pretty much all of the right atrium. And by the way, notice how the right atrium looks kind of funny. It looks kind of wrinkled almost. They've kind of put these little wrinkles in there. And it almost looks like it's like there's something sitting on top of the heart. We call that the auricle, and there's one on the right and there's one on the left. And that's just because most of the time the atria are not stretched to their capacity, they're not full, and so they end up kind of collapsing on themselves and looking kind of wrinkly like that. And we'll see that when you guys dissect the hearts in lab later next week. But anyway, it's still the right atrium, but we do call that kind of floppy part the auricle. Think of auricle as like the name for ear, and ears are kind of floppy and kind of hang off our head, and the same idea there. It's kind of a floppy part that looks like it's hanging off the top of the heart. Anyway, from the anterior view, you see mostly right atrium and right ventricle. You get just a little bit of the left ventricle and almost none of the left atrium from an anterior view, just a little bit, but it's mostly right-sided heart. If you want to see the left side of the heart, you really have to flip the heart over and look at a posterior view of the heart. Then you'll see you get almost all of the left ventricle there. You get pretty much all of the left atrium. You can also see the pulmonary veins as they come into the left atrium. You can see the superior and inferior vena cava. They tend to be more posterior on the heart. You get a little bit of right ventricle there and a little bit of right atrium on the posterior view. Notice as well, if we come back to the anterior view, notice the blood vessels that you can see easily. You can see the aorta easily, and you can see the pulmonary trunk leading to the pulmonary right and left pulmonary arteries. Those are more anterior in the heart, whereas the vena cava and the pulmonary veins are more posterior on the heart. Here's what it looks like grossly, and you guys will have a chance to look at some hearts and cut open some hearts, and so hopefully this picture will become very familiar to you. So notice again on the anterior view, it's almost all right-sided right ventricle and the right atrium. You're getting just a little bit of the left side of the heart, almost none of the left atrium there. And then you're getting aorta coming off here and pulmonary trunk. Those are what you can see well anteriorly. Posteriorly, again, mostly left ventricle there, a little bit of right ventricle here. You're able to see the left atrium as well. The left atrium is sometimes hard to see distinctly because the left pulmonary veins feed right into the left atrium. They kind of blend in together. And remember, you can also see the vena cava coming off the backside as well. So you've got inferior vena cava and superior vena cava that you can see well posteriorly. All right, so in between, separating the right and left side of the heart, are two what we call septums. So there's a septum in between the two atria, so we call that the interatrial septum. And then we have a septum in between the two ventricles separating right and left ventricle, and we call that the interventricular septum. So the interatrial septum is difficult to see on any of the pictures because the great vessels overlie the area where the interatrial septum is located. So you'll just have to kind of imagine that in between this right and this left atrium, there's a septum. You can, however, see the septum here between the two ventricles because that's actually quite large. And so that's easy to see. In addition to the interatrial and interventricular septums, you have 4 valves. I've already mentioned these before. You have 2 atrioventricular valves, or what we call AV valves. And they're called atrioventricular valves because they separate the atria from the ventricles. So it should be easy to remember that the valve in between the right atria and ventricle and the valve between the left atrium and ventricle, those are the AV valves. Now you've still got to remember which one is on the right and which one is on the left. So the tricuspid valve here is on the right and the mitral valve here is on the left. So you'll have to remember tricuspid on the right and mitral on the left. Sometimes we call the mitral valve the bicuspid, but that's getting to be an older name, and you'll hear most people just refer to it as the mitral valve. There are then 2 semi-lunar valves, and they're structurally different from the AV valves. That's why we separate them. And that's the pulmonic valve on the right, you can see here. And the aortic valve you can't really see in the picture, it's right there on the left. So remember, pulmonic on the right and aortic on the left. And you can remember the names pretty easily because they're named after the location where the blood is traveling to. So the pulmonic, that means pulmonary, means lungs. So the right side of the heart is pumping to the lungs, so it's going to go through the pulmonic valve. The left side of the heart is pumping to the aorta, so it's going to be the aortic valve. All right, and you guys will again see this picture several times as you hold the heart in your hand, and you'll be able to see here is the interventricular septum. Notice once again, look at how thick this left ventricle is. Super thick compared to the wall of the right. So this is going to be really important for you when you're doing your practical exam and I have a heart laying in a pan and it's upside down or it's looking backwards. You're not sure what you're looking at. You should be able to identify the left ventricle. It's surrounded by this super thick muscle all the way around, and it's one of the larger chambers, right? It's going to be a ventricle, and it's going to be super thick walled muscle. That's how you're going to identify it. Once you've identified the left ventricle, then you can see the right ventricle right next to it. You should be able to identify the valves. You should be able to identify then the major blood vessels coming off it as well. Okay, so let's talk just briefly about the valves. The AV valves, remember those are the ones between the right atrium and right ventricle and the left atrium and the left ventricle, the tricuspid and mitral valve. So these are different from the AV valves structurally. So let's just talk for a minute about how they are formed. You do have a connective tissue ring, and you can see that here in the picture, that kind of anchors the valve to the surrounding muscle. It gives the valve structure or support. Then you've got the cusps. These are kind of thin connective tissue, what we would call valves, the actual valve part of the valve. And you'll see when you cut open your hearts in class, they're really kind of thin. They're probably thinner than you imagine. And that's, for example, on the picture, that would be this part here, this here. Okay, that's all the cusps. Then you have what's called the chordae tendineae, or chordae tendineae, and that are these little kind of strands of connective tissue that come down off of the cusps and connect the cusps to the wall of the ventricle. And one of the places that it connects on the wall is called the papillary muscle, and that's this little muscle that kind of sticks out from the wall of the ventricle, and it's what kind of anchors the valve, the AV valve, it anchors it to the wall of the ventricle. And this is going to be very important because when the valve closes, it needs to be anchored to the ventricle so that the blood, the pressure from the blood does not force the valves to go through and open the other way and allow blood to leak. Okay, so the purpose of valves is so that when this chamber contracts and blood wants to move back into the atria, it hits the backside of these valves and it closes the valve. And that prevents blood from going back into the atria. So it forces the blood then to go out through the semi-lunar valves into the place where it's supposed to go. So valves function to prevent backflow of blood from the ventricle back into the atria. And those chordae tendineae and papillary muscles, they function to prevent that valve from over-closing, so to speak, and prolapsing and allowing blood to backflow. So that's really what it's for. Don't think of the papillary muscle as having any kind of function as to making the valve close. It's not like the papillary muscle contracts and it makes the valve close. No. The only thing that's making the valve close is the pressure from the blood that's trying to escape. And that blood, as it hits the backside of the valves, it causes the valves to close. The papillary muscle just functions to anchor. So think of that as more of an anchor. The chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles together just anchor those cusps. Back one slide, you can see here's a picture of the aortic valve closed, and you see how they fit together nicely, and so that's why they don't need that extra support. The semi-lunar valves are a little bit different. They don't need an anchor. They don't have chordae tendineae and papillary muscles because they don't need them. They're structurally different from the AV valves, and that's because they're composed of 3 different cusps, and those cusps will support each other when it's closed. So there's enough support between those 3 cusps that no papillary muscle or chordae tendineae is needed. If we go Okay, another important thing about the valves is that they cause what we call the heart sounds. If you ever take a stethoscope and you put it on someone's chest and you listen to the heart and you hear a bump bump, bump bump, or what we call lub dub, lub dub, lub dub. Those 2 heart sounds, dump dump, dump dump, those are caused by the closing first of the AV valves. That's going to be heart sound number 1, or what we call S1. Sorry, did not want to see that. Let's get rid of that. There we go. Sorry, what we call S1. So that's the AV valves closing. That's the first heart sound. And then the second sound of the lub dub is the semi-lunar valves closing, and we call that S2, or the second heart sound. So the only thing that we should really hear when we put a stethoscope to your chest and we're listening to heart, we should only hear those valves closing. That's all we should hear. 2 heart sounds, S1 and S2. Sometimes, however, we hear an extra sound, a sound that's abnormal. And if it's kind of a swooshing sound, like a shoo, shoo, shoo. So if you add in the lub dubs, you get boom, sh, boom, boom, sh, boom, boom, sh, boom. And that swishing sound is something we call a murmur. And that's just hearing the blood either as it goes through the valves. If the valves are a little bit stiff, for example, you may be able to hear the blood flowing through the valve. That would be abnormal. Sometimes if the valves get leak, you actually hear blood flowing backwards through the valve. It's not supposed to happen, right? The valves are supposed to prevent backward flow, but sometimes they get weakened and they allow a little bit of backward flow, and you'll hear a swishing sound that we call a murmur. Sometimes there's a little hole, maybe in the interventricular or the interatrial septum, and blood is flowing through that little hole, and it makes that swishing sound, what we call a murmur. So a murmur is pretty nonspecific. There are lots of causes of it, but sometimes we can tell from the character of the sound, the loudness of the sound, the location of the sound on the chest, where it's loudest, we can get an idea of what the problem might be. Typically, when we listen to heart sounds, we listen in 4 locations. You can see them highlighted here. And we listen first at the right upper sternal border, and we're going to listen to the aortic valve there. That's the best place to hear blood flowing through the aortic valve, which again, you shouldn't really hear. You should just hear the closing of the valve, but you shouldn't really hear any blood swishing through. Then we will go just on the other side of the sternum, and we will listen to the pulmonic valve. Then we will go down, right, still next to the sternum, but down a few ribs, and that's the best place to hear the tricuspid valve. And then lastly, we will move over to in between the sternum and the nipple and listen there for the mitral valve. So sometimes we say, we listen to apartment M, and that helps us remember which valves we're listening to as we put our stethoscope on the anterior chest. All right, let's talk a little bit about, we're going to shift gears from kind of the gross anatomy of the heart, and we're going to look at the vasculature of the heart, and we're going to start by looking at a case of Matthias. So Matthias is 67, and he's been having some chest pain while at work this morning, starting at 9:30. So he was lifting some heavy boxes, and he started getting some chest pain. Says it kind of started in the middle, and now it radiates down both shoulders. He's pale and sweaty. He's complaining of some nausea and some shortness of breath. He is a smoker and has some high blood pressure and diabetes. So the question is, what is causing his symptoms? So we're going to think about what might be happening to Matthias as we go through and look at the circulation of the heart. So just like every organ really needs to have circulation. So for example, your muscles have to have circulation, and your lungs have to have circulation, and your liver and your kidneys. Sometimes we forget that the heart, as the source or the pump of our circulatory system, needs to have its own system of circulation. It has to feed itself fresh blood and carry away from itself used up blood and waste products that are produced from the heart muscle, from the heart tissue. And remember how active the heart is. The heart is really one of the most active parts of our body, because it's beating at least 60 times a minute of every day of every year of your life. So there really needs to be a good, steady supply of fresh blood to the heart. And the way that your heart accomplishes that is through what we call the coronary arteries. So coronary refers to heart. So these are the arteries that feed the heart. And in fact, it's as if the heart knows, if there was such a thing, the heart knows how important its own survival is to the rest of the body. And so the very first organ that receives fresh blood from the aorta is the heart itself. So the very first branches coming off of the aorta are the coronary blood vessels. It's kind of like if you've ever been on an airplane and you watch those safety videos, and they talk about if cabin pressure drops and the masks come down out of the ceiling, they always say, please put on your own mask before trying to help other passengers. And that's really for parents, because the parents' instinct would be first to put on their kid's mask. The problem is, if you don't put your own mask on first, you may not be awake and alert enough to help anybody else. But if you'll give yourself oxygen first, then you'll be able to help those around you, because you'll be getting enough oxygen. And it's the same idea here with the heart. If the heart is going to continue to function to pump blood to the rest of the body, it has to make sure that it has its own fresh blood supply first. And so that's what happens with the coronary blood vessels. So you have one that comes off the right and one that comes off the left. We'll take a look at each of these and the circulation. So here's the aorta coming out. So blood is going from the left ventricle through the aorta. But you see the very first branches off the aorta are the right and the left coronary arteries. So we're going to talk first about this right one here that comes off the right side of the aorta. And so the main blood vessel that comes off is called the right coronary artery, but that artery has several branches. And I'm not going to make you learn all the branches, but I think there are a couple here on the anterior view, and there's going to be one on the posterior view that I want you to learn. So remember the right coronary artery, and then remember what we call the marginal branch. So that's this branch that comes off and kind of feeds the bottom part of that right ventricle. So that becomes very important. And then there are what we call atrial branches that come off, and they feed that portion of the right atrium. So make sure you know right coronary artery, the marginal branch, and the atrial branches. So for most of us, the right coronary artery is what we call the dominant branch, just meaning it supplies blood to the majority of the heart. So about 60% of people. And so it's going to supply blood to kind of this right side of the heart, but notice, if we're looking here on this picture, this is an anterior surface view, right? You're only feeding about this much of the anterior heart. We're going to see when we flip the heart over and look posteriorly that this right coronary blood vessel is feeding a lot of the posterior heart. Now, so you're going to get right atrium is going to be fed from the right coronary artery. A little bit of the left atrium, we'll see. That intraatrial septum, pretty much the entire right ventricle, a little bit of the left ventricle we'll see when we look posteriorly, and the sinoatrial node, or what we call the SA node. And we'll talk more about that later, but that's important for the beating of the heart. So if we turn the heart over and look posteriorly, we'll see that there is another major branch that comes down posteriorly off of the right coronary artery, and that's the posterior descending artery. There's some other names for it, and that's fine. I would just say learn the one that's in bold there. So here is the right coronary artery wrapping around the posterior chest, and notice that it's feeding most of the right ventricle here and here. It's starting to creep a little bit into the left ventricle, just a little bit. And so you can see how important that is. You can see how that is supplying blood to, probably at least more than 50%, maybe 60 or 70% of the heart for most of us. Everybody's anatomy is a little bit different when it comes to the coronary blood vessels, but for the majority of us, the right one is dominant. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that the left coronary artery is less important, because the left coronary artery is going to feed most of the left ventricle. And if you had to pick, one of the ventricles to get, damage to have a heart attack to, if somebody said, hey, you're going to have a heart attack, but I'm going to give you a choice. Do you want the right ventricle or the left ventricle? Remember that the right ventricle does not have to be as strong, because it's not pumping against as much pressure and it's not pumping as long of a distance as it pumps blood to the lungs. And remember that the left ventricle pumps blood to everywhere in the body, and so it has to be very strong in order to overcome all that resistance and all that pressure and to get blood all the way up to your brain and all the way down to your toes. So if I had to have a heart attack in my right or my left ventricle, I would choose my right. Of course, both of them can give you problems, but I would say that the left ventricle is probably more important just because it's the pump for the whole body. So the left coronary artery supplies blood to the left ventricle. That makes it very important, because if you get a clot in the left coronary artery, you're going to have damage likely to the left ventricle. You're going to have problem pumping blood to your body, and you're going to be in serious trouble. It also supplies 2/3 of the blood supply to the interventricular septum, most of the left atrium, and just this little bit here of the right ventricle. There are a couple of branches that you need to be aware of on the anterior view. So here's the left coronary artery. It's going to throw off a circumflex branch that goes around the backside of the heart, and it's going to throw off a left anterior descending branch. It should be easy to remember because it's left, it's on the anterior view, and it's descending from the top of the heart down to the bottom of the heart. This is what we sometimes call the widowmaker. If you have a clot in that artery and you cut off blood supply to the left ventricle, right ventricle, and the septum, you're not likely to survive. So that often results in sudden death and has been called the widowmaker. So a very important artery. If we look posteriorly, same picture, but now we're going to focus on the left. You see that circumflex branch coming around, feeding some of the left atrium, feeding the posterior portion of the left ventricle through another branch called the posterior left ventricular branch. So that's the other one other branch I want you to know here on the posterior view, just one for the left circulation. There are also numerous veins. I'm not going to make you learn these. I just listed them here for completeness sake, and you can see them. They pretty much follow the arteries, and we're going to see that as we look at circulation, that the veins pretty much follow the arteries. Often the veins will even take the same name as the artery, so it's going to make that easier to learn. Here in the heart, they don't take the same names, but you don't really have to memorize these ones, because when people have problems with coronary circulation, the problem is typically in the arteries and not in the veins. But you can see there's small, great middle veins and coronary sinuses. All right, so what is happening to our friend Matthias? So Matthias was at work. He was exerting himself. When you exert yourself, your heart needs to pump more blood in order to increase circulation to muscle, so muscle can make ATP, so you can have energy to work. Sometimes that is the stress that causes a heart attack. In clinical terms, we call a heart attack a myocardial infarction. Infarction just means kind of lack of oxygen, and cardial refers to heart, and myo refers to muscle. So this is reduced blood flow to heart muscle. That's what myocardial infarction means. Infarction also takes on the kind of the meaning of cellular death. So it's not just that we had like a temporary loss of oxygen. We had a lack of oxygen long enough that it actually killed muscle tissue. So that's going to be cell death due to a lack of oxygen. And the most common cause is when a clot, so let's say you had a coronary artery and it had a plaque, okay, and maybe had another little one there. And so the blood was flowing and the blood was still able to get through, even though there's kind of a narrowing there, right? Well, what happens is that sometimes a piece of this plaque breaks off and then it gets stuck in a narrowed space. And then a clot forms around that plaque and it prevents the blood from flowing. So the blood is not able to get past that clot. And that's what happened here with Matthias. So let's say, for example, if we have the left anterior descending and we've got somewhere down in there, we had a constriction, and then a clot broke off and got stuck in that constriction and caused a blood clot to form there. Now all of that tissue distal to where that blood clot is stuck is not getting blood flow, it's not getting oxygen, and those cells will die, and you get an infarction. And so this is what happened to our friend Matthias. So the very first thing, if I teach you one thing in all of anatomy that maybe, hopefully, will save somebody's life, just remember that if you think someone is having a heart attack, that they should chew, not swallow, it's better if you chew it, 4 baby aspirin. So find 4 baby. Now, if you don't have 4 baby aspirin and all you have is 1 adult aspirin, they can also chew the adult aspirin. It's just that it tastes pretty bad. So as soon as you can, chew 4 baby aspirin. Aspirin works by making our platelets less sticky. And platelets are platelets sticking together is one of the first steps in forming a clot. And so by taking the aspirin, we make those platelets less sticky and less likely to form a clot. And it may help prevent this small clot from turning into a big clot, and you may be able to save some muscle tissue. So remember, 4 baby aspirin chewed whenever you think someone's having a heart attack. All right, last thing we're going to talk about here is the conducting system of the heart. That's the electrical system. That's how the signal to contract gets carried throughout the heart. So there are 2 types of cells in the heart. The most numerous type of cell are contractile cells. They're the cells that are actually making the heart contract and beat, and that's 99% of the heart. But 1% of cardiac cells are what we call conducting cells. That means they don't actually do any contracting like muscle. They're not actually muscle cells like the rest of the heart. They're actually kind of an electrical cell, a cell that can either produce or carry along an electrical signal. And what's interesting about the heart is that it can produce its own electricity. Most of the body requires a signal from the brain or spinal cord in order to trigger that first electrical impulse. Well, the heart does not require that. The heart can do that on its own. And it has what we call a pacemaker, a natural pacemaker. And we'll talk more about this as far as the physiology goes when we get to physiology. But for now, just keep in mind that the heart does not need any external source in order to generate its electrical impulse that keeps the heart beating regularly. Now, the brain and spinal cord and nerves can go to the heart and affect that rate of electrical impulse, but it's not necessary. So we call those pacemaker cells because they keep the heart beating at a very regular rate. In fact, it's so regular, it's almost like a metronome. If any of you are musicians, you could almost play music to your heart rhythm because it's very regular. Whatever it typically runs at, 60, 70, for some of you 50 if you're athletes, it's very regular, and you could actually play music to the beat of your heart. All right, so there are a few components that you need to learn Hopefully you've heard some of these before. So the pacemaking begins at the sinoatrial node, and that's going to be up here in the right atrium. So this is the beginning. This is where the electrical impulse begins. And we don't like to say sinoatrial all the time, so we typically just call it the SA node. Sino stands for sinus. Sinus is what we call the rhythm when it's regular. And it begins in the atrium, so we call it the sinoatrial node. So that's where the electricity begins. From there, it's going to spread, of course, over to the left ventricle, over to the left atrium, so that the left atrium gets the electrical signal at about the same time as the right atrium. But it also has to send the signal down to eventually the ventricles. But on the way to the ventricles, it stops at another location that we call the atrioventricular node. So we've got two nodes, the sinoatrial node and the atrioventricular node. So it's called the atrioventricular node or the AV node because it's pretty much in a location that's right between the right atrium and the right ventricle. From there, from the AV node, it's going to travel down what we call the AV bundle, or we used to call it the bundle of His, and you might still see that, the AV bundle or the bundle of His. And from the bundle of His, the electrical signal is going to then split into the right and left bundle branches. So this is going to be the left bundle branch, and this is going to be the right bundle branch here. And from those bundle branches, it's going to go down to what we call the Purkinje fibers. And from the Purkinje fibers, that's where it's going to actually connect with those 99% of the contractile cells that are able to actually contract like muscle and cause those ventricles to squeeze. And of course, that has already happened up here in the atria as well. There is a moderator band. I'm not going to make you learn that. That goes to the papillary muscles, that causes the papillary muscles to contract just to kind of keep stiff the valves so that the valves don't prolapse when the ventricles contract. So you need to know SA node to AV node to AV bundle or bundle of His to right and left bundle branches and to Purkinje fibers, okay? So that's kind of what I want you to learn from here. Here's just showing you another picture of how that electrical impulse spreads. So at the beginning, it's going to start here at the SA node, right? That's the beginning. And that electricity is going to head towards the AV node, and it's also going to spread across to the left. By the time it reaches the AV node, it has completely notified all of the right atrial contractile cells to contract and all of the left atrial contractile cells to contract. So you're going to get contraction or systole of the atria at about the time that the signal is reaching the AV node. From the AV node, it's going to travel down the AV bundle, then the right and left bundle branches, the moderator band, and then the Purkinje fibers. And notice that there is no electrical signal, however, being transferred to the ventricles at this time. It's staying right along those conducting cells. That's because until the electrical signal gets to the Purkinje fibers, that electrical signal is not yet transferred to the contractile cells. So only here at the end, only after it's gotten to the Purkinje fibers, does it then spread throughout the ventricle to the contractile cells. And that becomes important, we'll see in physiology, because it allows contraction to begin at the apex of the heart. And that allows the blood then to be squeezed superiorly so that it can go out the aortic and the pulmonary valves. So if we put it all together, we get what we call the cardiac cycle. And the cardiac cycle can be described in lots of ways, and we'll spend a lot more time in physiology. I just want to introduce you to the idea here and to two terms, systole and diastole. So if we talk about the cardiac cycle, we can talk about it in terms of systole and diastole. Systole equals contraction, and diastole equals relaxation. So you can have atrial systole and ventricular systole. So when the atria are contracting, we say the atria are in systole, and that's this picture here. The electrical signal has spread, and those atria are contracting and kind of squeezing blood down into the ventricles. So we say that's atrial systole. Then on the next picture, you've got relaxation of the atria. That would be atrial diastole. And then you've got systole of the ventricles, where the ventricles begin to contract and squirt the blood to the lungs and to the rest of the body. And that would be ventricular systole. And then you get relaxation of the ventricles and of the atria, and you have both atrial and ventricular diastole. So remember that diastole means relaxation and systole means contraction. And so we'll talk more about that in physiology, but this is just to kind of give you an overview.